Let's try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Hiller, and I'm the Portfolio Director for Frame Week Africa. And I'm very excited to have everyone join us for our second Frames of Freedom webinar. Tonight's one is really excited, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our researchers and writers have been working on. If anything goes from the first one, there's going to be a lot of thought-provoking research that is going to be presented. And I do encourage you to ask questions as well. This is an interactive session. You will be able to raise your hands. You also have a Q&A section, so please use that. And just on behalf of Frame Week Africa, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gurasang.
Thank you so much, Martin, and the Frame Week Africa team. I am so happy to see you all back here, and the new people who are joining the webinar, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start today with Siyavuya Mfenqa, who's going to be talking about freedom, memory, and post-apartheid cinema. Siyavuya is actually one of the founders of Frames of Freedom, and he's a South African filmmaker, producer, activist, a film scholar whose work explores questions of identity, memory, social justice, and representation. A Simon Sabela Award nominee, a 2023 Mandela Washington Fellow, a 2025 Chevening Scholar. Siyavuya is currently pursuing a master's degree in film studies in the University of Liverpool. His research examines how the township has been constructed and circulated within post-apartheid South Africa, investigating whether film challenges is an enduring legacies of deposition and inequality are repackaged through marketable visual aesthetic. Thank you so much. Take it away, Sia.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Just let me know if there's a feedback, because I think I'm still getting the feedback, but I'm going to share my screen right now. All right. Do we have, can you guys see my screen?
We can see your screen, but we can't see your slides yet.
You can't see my slides. You should be, right. Just turn off my camera. Can you see my slides now? I think you should be able to see them.
Yes, now we can see them. Take it away.
All right, perfect. Just, I don't know, this is... My computer is trying to embarrass me. It's very slow. All right, I think we should be good. All right, welcome everybody. Apologies for me struggling with the technology, as I always do. My name is Siyavuya Mfenqa, and I would love to thank everybody for joining us today, as we are going to explore this topic that I'm currently working on, or the project, which is titled The Cinematic Fetishization of South African Post-Apartheid Township. So let's first try and get into the main research question and of why I am pursuing this study. The main research question says, how does post-apartheid South African cinema negotiate the township as both a site of cultural vitality and a commodified aesthetic? And what production or authorship practices resist turning lived suffering into a cinematic experience? Let's just pause there for a minute. All right. So, trying to get into the next slide. Okay. Let's take a moment and imagine. I want you to imagine what is the first picture that comes to your mind when you think of South African township? What is the first image that emerges? Is it maybe a shack? Is it maybe crowded spaces? Is it crowded streets, crowded interiors? Is it violence? Is it music? Is it Ubuntu? Is it community? Or is it something completely different? Whatever image comes to your mind, just hold on for it for a moment, because this paper is interested in how certain images come to stand for the township, where those images come from, and what happens when some ways of seeing the township becomes more powerful than the other. So, to explore that question, it is very important to sort of like understand the context of where the township comes from. I have structured the paper in three main components that are connected to each other. So, from how the township was historically made to how it is reconstructed on screen or in cinema, and finally, what happens when particular ways of seeing it becomes fetishized, commodified, and potentially exploited for cultural and commercial value. So, the first chapter is going to look at how the township was constructed through apartheid legislation and colonial control. The making of the cinematic township. The first part establishes that the township did not come from thin air. It was deliberately constructed through colonial land dispossession, forced dispossession, racial segregation, and brutal apartheid legislation that controlled where Black people could live, move, work, and own land. And the second chapter is going to be the reading of the township through uTsotsi, a film that I believe we all understand and we all know. So that's where the part moves from historical township to the cinematic township, using Tsotsi and Baba's concepts of hybridity, colonial mimicry, and that space. I examine how film constructs township identity as something contradictory, negotiated, and culturally active rather than simply fixed. And then the last chapter of this presentation or research is the cinematic fetishization of and the politics of township representation. This is where we ask when representation begins to operate as fetishization. I examine how poverty, violence, confinement, marginality can move from being realities represented on screen to becoming repeatedly selected, aesthetically privileged, and commercially compelling image through which township itself becomes recognizable. Now, the first point of departure is the making of the township. My apologies. I understand that a lot of us have studied this concept in our history class back in high school or primary school, but I think it's important for us to contextualize the making of townships before we move into how it's being exploited through cinema. So, a township is a space that did not emerge out of thin air. It was politically produced and it was not naturally formed. We can see this through land dispossession that created labor dependency for Black people. That process begins with the land. The 1913 Native Land Act severely restricted Black ownership of land, making it dependent from white colonial people, and dispossession therefore did more than take land. It created labor dependency, pushing Black people towards white farms, mines, and urban industry for survival. And the third point would be labor dependency became urban control. But once Black labor was driven into the cities, the state then had control where Black people could live. The 1923 natives' urban areas effectively treated Black urban presence as conditional on labor. Black workers were needed close to the city, but Black life was not allowed equally to access the city. And last point is the afterlife of apartheid that creates the cinematic problem. Apartheid then was defeated, but the Group Areas Act, but apartheid was defeated, but the South African cinematic industry sort of like revisited the township as a place where they can tell the Black stories. But now the question of this research is, what ethical responsibilities can be applied when telling township stories? Now, let's read Tsotsi through the township. So, we have established that the township was politically produced. Chapter 2 then turns to Tsotsi to examine how that historically constructed space is represented on screen through Baba's concepts of hybridity, colonial mimicry, and third space. I'll be looking at Homi K. Baba as my framework or theoretical framework, where he explores this concept of hybridity. So how does he define it? Baba defines hybridity as where identity is not culturally pure or permanently fixed. It is produced through negotiation between different cultural influences, histories, and ways of living. So in Tsotsi, how do we see this? We see this through the coexistence of criminality and Ubuntu. Tsotsi's shack begins as a space associated with violence and crime, but the arrival of the baby that he got from the car transforms that same space into a vulnerability, care, and responsibility. And also, the element of Ubuntu, which is traditionally inherited by Black South Africans, still emerges through the character of Miriam, who develops this further. Her willingness to take care of the baby, or rather to breastfeed a child that she understands was stolen through crime, is another form of Ubuntu. So that's how hybridity is being explored in this film, Tsotsi. And also hybridity therefore allows me to, resist reading the township through one fixed identity. So violence and care, criminality, responsibility, deprivation, and Ubuntu can exist within the same space, even though it's contradictory. But there's also a tension here. Celebrating this adaptability can make structural inequality easier to overlook, become attention shifts towards how communities survive rather than the conditions that they are being forced to survive. But hybridity tells us what can emerge when different cultural worlds meet. The next question is what happens to the colonial forms themselves when they continue into the post-colonial presence, which takes us to the idea of colonial mimicry by Baba, which is he defines it as almost the same, but not really the same. So if hybridity asks what kinds of identities emerge through cultural contact, then colonial mimicry asks what happens when inherited colonial forms continue to structure Black life, but are appropriated and reproduced differently. So Baba describes colonial mimicry as it is built around contradiction. The colonized subject is encouraged to adopt the colonizer's language, education, values, and behavior, but is never intended to fully become equal. The result is what Baba really describes as almost the same, but not quite. So we can recognize the afterlife of this in every ordinary township. Umzekelo, if you live in the township and you try to pick a hobby, which is like golf, tennis, ballet, you are going to be laughed at. Oh, Zamuzan's Mlungu, he thinks he's white, she thinks she's white. That's another form of colonial mimicry that exists amongst ourselves on a daily basis without us even consciously understanding that these are acts of colonial mimicry. If if I buy myself some nice clothes or if I have a little bit of money, I'll be like, "Dingumlungu namhlanje." That's another way of how colonial mimicry manifests itself. And also sometimes this extends into how we value proximity to whiteness itself through historically white neighborhoods, schools, lifestyles, or even treating English as a more valuable language than our own indigenous languages. So these jokes may be light, but the history underneath is very serious. Certain forms of wealth, education, leisure, language, and social mobility became historically coded as white, or can only be accessible as white. So how is colonial mimicry applied in Tsotsi? In my reading of Tsotsi, this contradiction appears through the character's relationship with the wider urban world as it symbolizes the status of mobility. Tsotsi wears all these styles, he handles money, he desires to drive cars and moves through the spaces associated with prosperity, but he does so from a position of exclusion. He can reproduce the signs of mobility without possessing the equal access to the structures that make the mobility possible. The stolen car gives Tsotsi the access to the world, but not belonging. Another form of colonial mimicry in Tsotsi is explored through Itsotsital. We know Itsotsital as language as a lokshin, but now Itsotsital complicates this further. It takes languages shaped by South Africa's colonial urban history, mixes it, reshapes them, and produces something distinctively rooted in the township identity. We know, mhlambe, some of us can, excuse my profanity, words such as futek. So many people don't even know that it's an Afrikaans word. We use it so frequently that we even forget that it was a colonial language. That's how colonial mimicry manifests itself. We even have the recent one nowadays, which is Andigo India Departure. That is literally English, but it is used in indigenous terms. So the point here is mimicry reveals a contradiction. Colonial forms may survive beyond colonialism, but Black subjects do not simply reproduce them. They appropriate them, transform them, and give them new meanings. And then, since we have explored the colonial mimicry, let's move on to the third space. Baba seems the third space as a space of between belonging and exclusion. So the third space asks, what does cultural negotiation, where does cultural negotiation take place? The township exists between rural memory and urban modernity and communal belonging and individual aspiration. So in Tsotsi, the movement between the township and suburb reveals the difference between access and belonging. So if hybridity tells us what emerges and mimicry shows us how inherited forms are transformed, Baba's third space asks, where does all this negotiation take place? Baba explains that space as an in-between space where different cultural meanings and identities and identities and ways of living meet and are renegotiated. It disrupts the idea that identity must belong completely to one world or another. In the township, this in-between position exists between rural memory and urban modernity, indigenous values, and colonial influences. So I think a very clear example that I would make about myself is I really identify with this third space or in-betweenness. I was raised as Lalini from the homestead, Eastern Cape, but also I spent a large part of my childhood in the township of Lokshin. But also at the same time, I still had friends who lived in the suburbs. So it's the ability of being able to tap into these three different worlds and eventually forming identity that is neither belongs to any of these spaces. But in this concept, I use this I need to apply it fully carefully because the township did not become an in-between space through free culture exchange. That condition was politically produced through land dispossession, labor migration, and segregation. Black communities carried their languages, their customs, and communal values into urban environments they had been forced to negotiate. So the third space of the township is culturally productive, but it is also historically unequal. And again, in Tsotsi, that space is explored through visible contrast between the township and affluent suburbs. We all know the proximity in South Africa of wealth and poverty, Sandton and Alexandra, these affluent suburbs, and also Tsotsi belongs to the township and understands its language, its social codes, yet the security, mobility, and material freedom he desires appears to exist somewhere outside the township. So the goal is to always leave the township. It's a dream that is far-fetched, but yet very close. So the stolen car allows him to physically cross between those worlds. But again, that car gives him access, but not belonging. He can enter the suburbs, move through it temporarily, occupy its symbols of wealth, but the movement does not erase the social and economic distance between the two spaces. And importantly, the family that he robs is also black, which is ironically, so Tsotsi is not simply contrasting black poverty with white wealth. It shows that post-apartheid black life itself contains radically different experiences of mobility, security, and economic access. So the point here is that space allows me to read Tsotsi as a character caught between belonging and aspiration. He can move in between different social worlds, but that movement itself does not guarantee equal access or belonging. So sonke, we understand that we can go to Sandton, sifike sihlale kweza restaurants ezifensi and drink wine, but okusalayo at the end of the day, iteksi egodukayo iye Soweto. So taken together, hybridity, mimicry, and third space, they reveal a township that is far more complex than a fixed image of poverty and criminality. But that complexity creates the next problem. If township is multi-layered, why do certain images, violence, and confinement remain so dominant on the screen? And that is where the discussion begins to move from representation to fetishization. So on the third chapter, which is the last chapter, we are going to explore what are the ramifications of misrepresenting the township, and we are going to be looking at the theoretical framework of Stuart Hall and Jordan Elpin. So from representation to fetishization, what is the threshold? The first distinction I want to make is that representing poverty is not the same as fetishizing poverty. Township poverty, overcrowding, terrible housing are equal conditions with indefinable political and historical origins. To remove these realities from cinema would simply sanitize that history. The question then is, what happens when these conditions, once they enter representation? Stuart Hall argues that selected fragments of frames can acquire enough representational power to begin standing in for a much more complex whole. Elpin also identifies a similar process in township cinema where informal housing, crowded streets, cramped interiors, poverty, violence, decay repeatedly become familiar makers of what the value of the township is expected to look like. So building from Hall's scholarship and Elpin, I understand that cinematic fetishization as a cumulative process of selection, repetition, reduction, and fixation, and aestheticization. So the threshold is cross when selected signs of marginality become so familiar and visually compelling that they begin to function as a shorthand for a township life itself. But for certain images to eventually stand the entire community, to stand for an entire community, they first have to acquire the power to define how community is recognized. This takes me to Hall's discussion of stereotyping when differences become fixed. For Hall, stereotyping works by reducing people into a limited set of characteristics, exaggerating those characteristics and eventually presenting them as natural and unchanging. Applied to the township, repeated images of poverty, criminality, and disorder can therefore be more than simply describing the inequality. They can gradually become the terms through which the township itself is recognized. Hall also draws from Gramsci, also helps us understand how this becomes a form of cultural power, particularly ways of seeing can become more normalized than they begin to appear natural for self-evident. Now, the question moves away from whether the image is simply positive or negative. Deeper question, I guess, is whether particular images have acquired the cultural authority to define what the township means. And once representation becomes a question of power, another question follows. Who has the authority to select and frame and circulate these images from the first place? Which takes us to the third point. So says who gets to look authorship and representational power? This brings me to the authorship and the wide gaze. Hall, drawing from Fanon, reminds us that looking is not always natural, is not always a natural act. Historically, Black people or Black subjects have often occupied the position of being observed, classified, and interpreted by those who possess the greater cultural representation authority. That tension is particularly interesting in Tsotsi. Arthur Fugard wrote the source novel of the film. Gavin Hood adapted and directed the film. Lance Gower shaped its cinematography, and Peter was its principal producer. So then my argument is not whether white filmmakers cannot tell Black stories. The question is about the historical position from which Black township is being interpreted. Alapin also described whose camera as occupying an outsider position and asks a powerful question: who controls the screen image in post-apartheid South Africa? I further extend that question beyond the filmmaking of Tsotsi, because Tsotsi was also financed, distributed, and culturally validated through institutions that enabled the film and its image to travel internationally. Now, let's move on to the last part, which is power and fantasy, and why marginality becomes cinematically desirable. So, this is where Hall's discussion of power and fantasy becomes useful. Hall argues that racial representation cannot be understood only by asking whether an image is accurate or inaccurate. Representation can also be organized through fear, desire, fantasy, and fascination. So that question becomes not only what do we see, but what repeatedly becomes compelling to see, what excites us to see. In Tsotsi, crime provides narrative momentum, violence produces tension, um, and these shacks that are cramped, interiors, narrow streets, shebeens, crowded environments create an immediately recognizable cinematic vocabulary. Again, none of these images is necessarily false. The tension begins when historically produced conditions acquire a second function. So poverty remains a deprivation, but it can also become visually compelling. Criminality remains a social problem, but it also creates narrative excitement. Informal housing remains evidence of inequality and a dark political past of apartheid, but it can also become part of a recognizable cinematic aesthetic. That is it. Thank you very much for listening to me. Ndipkobil.
Thank you so much, Sia. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before I open it up to the audience. So my first question is, where do you draw the line between telling authentic stories of our people and this being a fetish?
Oh, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Giving a feedback. I think it's your microphone, Corey. Can you have it?
You're also still sharing, quit sharing?
All right, let's do that. Am I still sharing? All right. So can you please repeat your question?
Where do you draw the line between telling authentic South African stories and these images of the township being a fetish?
All right. So there's a very fine line in being able to say whether township images are being used as a fetish or they are authentic. As Stuart Hall sort of describes that the repeatedness of showing the similar images from the township can be a form of using it as a fetish. If we are always seeing these cramped interiors, if we are always exposed to township poverty, then that sort of becomes an exciting way of consuming the township, because there's also other different elements of understanding the township except those parts that can be stereotypical. So I guess being able to not tell or rather fetishizing the township is the ability to tell it from a different point of view that doesn't necessarily exploit these motifs that Stuart Hall is talking about, which is obviously the poverty, cramped interiors, and etc.
You touched briefly on the white agency and creative power that they have in cinema to tell Black stories. In what ways do you think this can be done in a responsible way or in a way that benefits everyone, including the people who live in the townships?
So the paper itself doesn't say it is not or rather white creators or any other people from other side of the world cannot tell Black stories. But now, rather township stories, not Black stories, township stories. For example, I made this example where I also grew up in the township, and I've never recognized myself as a poverty-stricken person. Life was always normal because we had always slept with food, we had clothes, and but now when you turn on your television, you see these, you see this poverty being exaggerated, this crime being exaggerated. So that is also something that Stuart Hall speaks about, the exaggeration of when people are looking from the outside, they see those particular motives, and then when they tell those stories, they exaggerate them or amplify them beyond what they really are. So I guess being able to consult people that live into those spaces is another form of telling township stories in an ethical way, because they understand how it's like to live in those spaces rather than when you're looking from the outside and telling them from your perspective.
Okay. Open it up to the audience. How do South African filmmakers negotiate liberation history, inherited trauma, and unfinished freedom in post-apartheid storytelling?
Ooh, that's a nice one. I think maybe also we as filmmakers, we have to be responsible when telling township stories. And there's a part that I didn't touch on my presentation, but it is there in my dissertation, which speaks a lot about township, or proposes that township should be regulated as a space where there has to be a sort of giving back to the township if you're telling the township stories, because you get these commercials, these streaming services, there's broadcasters, they go shoot films in the township and they don't give back to the township. And people that live in the township, they still remain poor, they remain without anything. So to answer your question, I think us as filmmakers as well should encourage being responsible in making sure that the people that we tell. Sorry, please mute. So the people that we tell the stories about are financially recognized or have a way of benefiting. For example, you have District 9 that came and made a film in the township, made a lot of money, but they didn't build one youth center over there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if we can encourage policy and the regulation of the township, if you have a 10 million budget, 0.5% or 0.1% should go to benefiting people that live in those townships, build a youth center, take children to universities, um, teach them how to be DOPs, how to be directors, actors, and but there should be a way of giving back to the township because I think I read the other article from the NFF, but that was like in 2020, 2021. It says the revenue of the South African film industry in the South African economy is about 7 whatever billion rands. And part of that money is money that was made from the township, but the people in the township didn't get a dime.
Thank you, Sia. Are there any questions in the room? You can go ahead, Lindani.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Testing, something. Hello, can you guys hear me?
No, bro, we can't hear you. Yeah, he said he's gonna text the question. Maybe move on to the next one, Khadi. You're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm not muted on my side. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was just apologizing to Lindani that we can't hear him. So if he texts, he must text it on the chat and then we'll address the question. But if there aren't any more questions, we can move on to the next speaker, who is Mamodibe. Mamodibe, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, while she's getting ready, I'll briefly introduce her to you. So Mamodibe is going to be talking about creative freedom versus independency in African cinema. Mamodibe Ramodibe is an actress and television scholar specializing in the analysis of power, representation, and narrative construction in television. She obtained a dramatic arts qualification from Wits University, and she also holds an MA in film and television studies from the University of Cape Town. Mamodibe has built credibility in the entertainment industry through a range of substantial and intriguing roles on screen and on stage. Some of her notable screen productions include A Soweto Love Story and Go on Netflix, and Tax Season 1, 2, and 3 on BET. And a noteworthy mention of her recent success is a leading role as Buang in the second and final season of Outlaws, a Showmax original. And she'll be talking to us today about the transgressive matrix and exploration of female agency and resistance in South African telenovelas. Take it away.
Thank you, Khudi. I'm going to close my camera and then present. But I'll just make sure that everybody can see my screen if I do that. Okay, screen window or tab. I don't. Screen. Share entire screen. Okay, is my screen? There we go. Can everyone see my screen? Khudi, can you just say yes? That would be...
Yes. Now we can see it. Thank you.
Everything. All right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Fame Week. Thank you, Frames of Freedom, for this opportunity to present our research. The title of my dissertation is Transgressive Black Matriarchs. It is a completed study, and I was exploring female agency and resistance in South African telenovelas. So the statement you see there boldly at the top of the slide, Black women who pursue selfhood are considered transgressive, is the catalyst and the preliminary sort of curiosity I had about women that I began to observe in my personal life. So the positionality that I situated and I occupied in this research became very important and very relevant very quickly. So I had to accept that I am a Black woman writing about Black women, and that my contribution and that positionality is not a weakness, but it is a valuable contribution to the conversation. And so my witness rather informs some of the observations that I began to make. My maternal grandmother, my mother, and even some Black women in my familial space, just observing how, despite the fact that they wore the hat of mother and wife and sister and daughter, they pursued selfhood. But what was interesting about their pursuit of selfhood is that they were easily ostracized, even by their own family, or by cultural practice and socially constructed notions of femininity. I don't know why. Should I show you a different presentation? Can everyone sorry, I'm getting a text from Hodi that my slides are blurry. I don't know if it's for everybody. What I will do then, apologies everybody, but I'll have to do this. Okay. Present. Oh, is this better?
I'm not sure if it's just me. Okay. Please continue. It's probably just on my side.
All right. So my observation is that, according to cultural practice or socially constructed notions of femininity, these women would be considered transgressive because they deviated from what would be considered as what is the ideal Black womanhood and the confines in which Black women should exist in. And so that led me to the question you see at the bottom of the slide that asks, how are Black women then who transgressed framed and constructed on screen? And because I was studying in the realm of television and building up my scholarship in television studies, I had to anchor my work in this realm. And interestingly, my initial references for transgressive Black womanhood, you'll see as I continue to speak about my theory and other works that built on this notion, my initial reference for transgressive Black womanhood started in the public domain. So works such as works from Mamodibe Ramodibe influenced a lot of my ideologies, as well as the iconography of the late Winnie Madikizela Mandela. So the main question was, how are Black women who transgress framed on screen, and what social, cultural, or social political boundaries do they transgress? And most importantly, what are then the implications of these transgressions that these women might be engaging in? So in my dissertation, my case study, let me start here. So in building on the idea of transgression, it was also important that I defined what I meant by transgression. A large part of the literature that speaks to the representation of Black women or the misrepresentation of Black women, I would find speak to unruly or deviant or ungovernable, but transgression was an important concept to define for myself in my research, because initially it speaks about a boundary, and this is echoing some of the ideas that are underpinning my study. And the ideas are that in a heteropatriarchal society rather, there are certain prescriptions, whether socially or culturally, that define what a Black woman should be and how, and the parameters in which she should exist in. And so transgression then allows for us to understand the intersectionality of the different systemic ways in which Black women are oppressed. And an example of this is Mamodibe Ramodibe on being transgressive writes that, when a Black woman in particular decides to subvert a particular social cultural expectation, she becomes unpopular. And this resonated with the woman that I had started to observe. One of the things that Mamphele cites during the Black consciousness movement in the struggle was that women's opinions in the movement were only valued when Black women held what she called an honorary male status, or where they represented a male opinion. So if a wife of someone like her, the wife of the late Steve Biko at the time, her opinion would be considered valuable because of the presence of a male figure. She also speaks about pushing back in meetings as a Black woman, and that would not be received well by the Black men in the struggle. And what it revealed to her is that Black women in the Black consciousness movement then started to be conscientized about not only are we oppressed as a race, but now we are oppressed as Black women. So in this context, then we then begin to see that transgression is when women talk back, when women push back. But we also see then the double layers of oppression for Black women, that it is race, gender, and you'll see later on that it also reveals a class oppression. So transgression as a conceptual framework was very important for me to establish and to understand the broad ways in which it encompasses not just crossing a boundary, but what it also means for what it reveals for us. And so in citing the Mamphele Ramphele experiences, I want to reveal to you that these ideas are very much embedded in our political history and are constructed by the hegemonic cultural societal norms that we live in today. And in building an understanding then of transgression, I gleaned on work from the feminist writer Phumla Gqola's work, Julian Wolfrey, and Christina Foe in trying to come to a definition that I would use in my dissertation. So just to briefly speak about where these ideas stem from these writers. For Phumla Gqola, she writes specifically about feminist literature, African feminist literature. And in her definition of transgression, she locates African feminist literature as doing something different in contemporary African times, that it's no longer responding to white feminism, it's no longer responding to colonialism, but African feminist writing is going into a time where it's finding its own, for lack of a better word, magic. it's defining itself as something different. It's no longer reactive to other voices. So for her, transgression connotes deviance, protest, and crossing a boundary. Julia Wolfrey then posits that transgression can be seen as something that is dynamic. So, the dictionary definition for transgression is quite rudimentary. It states there is a boundary, and if you cross it, you've transgressed. But I was looking for something more than that in a way to articulate the things that I was seeing from these two characters and to expand on the idea of what I mean by transgression. So from Julia Wolfrey's definition of transgression, she notes that it's seen as dynamic, it's subversive, it's a subversive act that interrogates and redefines the boundaries of what is considered acceptable or possible within a given context. And then finally, Christina Foe's definition, what was key for me there is that transgression can actually be perceived as a mode of resistance, disrupting social order, and then finally, transgression can also be perceived as a tool for social change. And so I used all of these ideas to define transgression as utterances, enactments, or representations of deviance in my dissertation. And these actions throughout my analysis can be characterized by a deliberate violation of acceptable behavior for Black women as prescribed within patriarchal structures, actions that can be considered as mode of resistance, subversion, and transcendence of established boundaries of heteronormative behavior, and finally, acts that offer alternatives to existing norms. And I think the last characterization is really where a large part of the arguments that I make, even in my conclusions, stem from, that the woman in the study, the Black female protagonist, that is Cindy Latu's Lindiwe Dikana from The River, as well as Connie Ferguson as Harriet Khoza from The Queen, that ultimately their representation is opening a door for alternative ways of being a Black woman on screen. So the matriarchs examined in the study through their various transgressions can be read as symbols of change as they enact motherhood, widowhood, femininity in novel meanings, and they redefine the boundaries. If you consider just the previous slide from Christina Fo's definition of transgression, that transgression can be considered as not just a mode of resistance, but offering an avenue for social change. And so, as I've mentioned briefly, that the two protagonists I chose for this study, Harriet Khoza and Lindo Dikana, and while Mamsonto Mulefe from Gomora was also someone that I could have used as a lens to explore this idea, I think that these two characters specifically for me were doing something different. They were departing from the traditional ways in which Black matriarchs have been shown, and specifically that they occupy the protagonist role. So in my dissertation, the thematic concepts that I explore these ideas of transgression is the confines of motherhood within the African context, widowhood, criminality and violence, but for the purpose of today's presentation, for Harriet Khoza, I'll speak to widowhood, and for Lindo Dikana, I'll speak to violence and criminality. So what makes them transgressive is probably something that a question we're all sitting with to a certain extent, but I'd like to jog your memory all the way back to post-94 soap opera times. The Rainbow Nation and the Rainbow Nation discourse was what impacted the television landscape of South Africa. And so, unfortunately, the images of Black women that emerged from soap operas such as Generations, to a certain extent, even Seva Delan, still maintained the apartheid stereotypes. For instance, in Generations, there was a character called Mam Ruby, and she embodied the mammy figure, which is it's actually a reiteration from American soap operas. So Mam Ruby as a character, she embodied this counsel, nurturer, wise woman of the community. And interestingly, despite the fact that she owned a business, she was reduced to this domestic sphere, and we didn't see her outside of that plane. And so part of the apartheid stereotypes are the mammy figure. I also speak to what I observed as to be the invisible Black woman. So during apartheid, Black women mostly occupied low-skilled jobs as domestic workers. But if you go back to some of the early shows, some of the shows during apartheid, pardon me, you will see that even white women were cast as domestic workers because Black women were not allowed. Well, Black people were just not allowed in that space, were not allowed to be represented. Last week, Apiwe actually extensively spoke to how the apartheid government used television in South Africa as a tool for propaganda. So this also had its manifestations in the fictional representations that we would see. So the fact that a white woman was portraying a domestic worker role in a soap opera, for instance, or in a drama, was revealing to me that the invisibility of Black women was still being perpetuated. And so the women in the study exemplify, as I've mentioned, a departure from the traditional matriarch that we've seen on screen. So what emerges from my analysis, as I said, I'd only be speaking to certain thematic concepts because I really would like to delve in as best as I can into the meat of the arguments that I make. For Harriet Khoza, I'll focus on widowhood. And what I did in this section of my dissertation is that I used feminist and scholarly observations on traditional Zulu mourning practice as a lens to explore the varied ways in which Harriet transgresses mourning rites. So in many African societies, cultural practice and traditions tend to bestow the responsibility of disseminating values and traditions to women. So in this analysis, I examine her characterization as a matriarch and the acts of transgression she enacts within widowhood to determine the extent to which she complicates the matriarchal figure on screen. In addition, the nature of cultural custom and practice in heteropatriarchal society is that they tend to privilege the rights of men at the expense of women. And one of the ways this manifests itself is through traditional mourning rites. So my focus then on widowhood, on the widowhood theme, is also due to the inscriptions it imposes on African women in the context of South African Zulu mourning practices. And these inscriptions create boundaries or limit Black women and the ways that they are expected to exist. And so I'm interested in how Harriet negotiates these very rigid inscriptions, and by extension, then she then disrupts the matriarch role. What I also found from the analysis is that Harriet doesn't simply disrupt or, she doesn't just simply undermine mourning rite custom, but she actively is forging her own way of grieving, while also protesting explicit gender inequalities and striving for autonomy within the very confines of Zulu cultural practice. Just some insights from before I do two key examples. Existing scholarship also on cultural mourning rights and practices concerning Black women in South Africa and in the content at large maintains that customs of cultural grieving practices oppress, ostracize, and in some instances dehumanize the woman. And so what was important for me in my observations from the textual analysis was being able to identify to what extent does she uphold, maintain, and to what extent does she subvert these inscriptions. There is something that Mamphela Ramphele calls a liminal space that widowhood confines women in. And what this liminal space is that it ties the widow to her deceased spouse. And it is actually a performative place for both the family and the public. So the widow literally becomes a site for the family's pain and for the public to know that she's a widow. So it is both this, and then there is also the expectation that despite your husband dying, there must be this perpetual loyalty, not just to your deceased husband, but to the family as well, in so upholding the customs. So it is both this liminal space and the ambiguity of wifehood within widowhood that is at the center of patriarchal cultural custom. Harriet Khoza engages in acts of transgression that resist, and to borrow Ramphele's phrase, it resists this liminal space. She physically moves in and out of her assigned place of mourning and interacts freely socially. Something that is worth calling attention to in this moment is the parallels that exist between cultural practice in this instance and the telenovela genre in terms of spatial location of women. It was interesting for me to see that the telenovela and I guess, mourning rites in this instance designate this intrinsic position of women. So the liminal space during mourning and the predominant space in which we see women in telenovelas is the domestic, it's the bedroom, it's the kitchen. So it was very interesting for me already to just pick up on how the telenovela genre also exposes these areas of contention in terms of women and space. So just for context, during the time of mourning, widows are expected to undergo ritual practice, such as being fully covered in Black clothing that is made from inexpensive material, covering their face with Black veils, covering their shoulders. In some instances, a Black widow is expected to shave her head fully, and in public, she must make room for other pedestrians. On the road, if she's commuting by a taxi, she must sit at the back so not as to expose other people to her back because she's believed to be defiled, and she carries an omen. And so there are various tenets of what the Zulu mourning practice entails. And what is common amongst mourning practices and quite relevant to Ukzila specifically is this idea of sitting. Right, the sitting is the foremost sort of liminal position, and it means that for those of you who don't know, when a Black widow has lost her husband, she is meant to sit on a mattress, and she can't do anything outside of things that require, I guess, relieving herself in the bathroom, but she can't interact with other men. She can't, everything, she's served on that mattress. She lives and breathes in this liminal space. And I argue that, you know, it renders women almost as victims in this instance. So Harriet Kosa's depiction through an array of agentic positions violates and undermines prescriptions for Black widows within the context of Zulu mourning practices. Furthermore, she resists the cultural conceptions of the ideal wife, right? So the ideal wife in the Zulu cultural context would be the wife who maintains loyalty to deceased husband and to deceased family by upholding these cultural customs. And these are obviously informed which is informed and prescribed by her relationship with her husband and her children. So by orchestrating the death of her husband and allowing herself to enter prematurely into the state of widowhood, one can argue that she performs a double transgression. Again, she commits murder, and then she allows herself then to be a widow. So some of the instances that came out from my analysis is in the first scene of the second scene of the first episode. You know, there are clear signs of a woman in mourning. We, you know, the set dressing tells us that, the regalia that she's in tells us that. But quite interestingly, she's not rooted in this sitting position. In fact, she wants to get involved in arranging the funeral logistics for her husband. She also dresses quite glamorously. So I've just cited how there are expectations in which a Black widow is supposed to dress, but Harriet deliberately dresses glamorously throughout her mourning period. Her wardrobe consists of a pair of black and floral court heels, a fitted suit, trousers, embellished blazer, jackets, white collared shirts, and she's always just well put together. She also wears bold makeup. What was striking for me was the bold red lip and the strong eyeshadow. And we can argue that, you know, these were makeup choices. However, we have seen women on screen in fictional representation occupy the quote unquote realness of widowhood. There was something quite deliberate about these aesthetic choices for Harriet. So she also wears a curly weave. She leaves her head uncovered. Part of operating within the widowhood liminal space means ascribing to dehumanizing and denigrating acts such as shaving their head, and I've mentioned that, wearing all Black clothes made from inexpensive material, wearing clothes inside out sometimes, and wearing one shoe. Harriet's makeup and wardrobe choices reflect her social standing. And so I argue that the choices suggest a reclaiming of selfhood within the confines of oppressive cultural practice. The transgressive act of embracing her beauty and sense of style as a widow could be read beyond the fictional occurrences contained solely within this text. I make references to the fact that for me, it called to mind Winnie Madikizela Mandela and how her decision to embrace her beauty and her sense of style became a site of resistance and strategic mobilization of popular support for her anti-apartheid resistance. So if we consider then the rigidity and control exerted over the female body during the mourning period, and where it becomes a public site for loss and for pain, choosing then to oppose being subject and object of ritual practice is defiant, and both in the context of political widowhood and widowhood itself. So Harriet's embracing of beauty and femininity become a tool of resistance for her. She's reclaiming control of her body, which during this time of mourning is meant to be a metaphor for suffering. There's one more example I'd like to pull out before I move to the next slide. That there are inherent double standards in the Zulu culture, and rejection is tied to the emotional abuse she endured during these extramarital affairs. It is unlikely that she would receive vindication for attempting to expose his infidelity to her in-laws. And so in this regard, Rosenblatt and Ngosi, which are some of the scholars that I was pulling my claims from, posit that in Zulu cultural tradition, widows are expected to observe mourning practices of Ugzila and uphold the integrity of the deceased husband, even if the husband had been abusive, neglectful, or abandoned them. And so Harriet's defiance implies a resentment to the patriarchal ideologies that inform the Zulu culture. Let me move on. So before I move on, actually, sorry, one more thing. So the tensions of power and gender inequality that Harriet contends within widowhood, I argue, are reflective of a broader social political status of Black women, that Black women find themselves in, rather, in under traditional mourning practices. The display of resistance towards the mourning practice on her part not only offer a new representation of widowhood on screen, but also initiate a dialogue or a critique of the discrepancies and issues concerning the rights and customs of mourning in the local culture that women endure. Hudi, am I still good for time? I can't see the...
You are so good. You have 4 minutes left.
Oh, that's not enough. I was enjoying Harriet's slides too much. So with Lindo Dikana, she defies socially constructed ideas of what the ideal feminine is, femininity is. So the belief that crime and violence is inherently masculine makes her transgressive. So through her violent and criminal actions, Lindiwe transgresses the social construction of femininity. And I use Sabine Binder's concept of violent female masculinity, which asserts that violating traditional conceptions of femininity as constructed as, nurturing, compliant, and vulnerable, the agency of a woman as a murderer is not only disturbing, but it is extremely subversive. So Lindiwe transgresses the stereotypical Black matriarch, as she's also depicted beyond motherhood. We know from The River, she's a CEO. She actively engages all of these roles fully. But what is important that I'd like to pull out from my findings in this section is that her demonstration of violence is not something I celebrate in my dissertation, but I call it out as something that has been inherently a double standard, where men on screen have been allowed, Black men, white men on screen have been allowed to exist in their complexity, but because of prescriptions of culture, Black women acting in sorts of crime and violence has been automatically relegates them to villainy, right? So Superstar draws on the work of Winnie Madikizela Mandela to demonstrate how diverse expressions of complicated womanhood can and should exist as part of dismantling the pressure of patriarchy and its ongoing efforts to confine the space within women must exist in. Superstar also highlights the imbalance, which I've just shared now, between male and female characters, where male characters are free from the essentialist views and binaries, and argues that similarly nuanced approaches need to be recognized, as Black women having complexity of human experiences should be explored as well. So one of the most important things that come out of my analysis for Lindiwe Dikana is that she actually even says this in the show, that she engages in crime because she comes from abject poverty. And it's something that Wendy Ashley, who's an American scholar, speaks about, that what hasn't been explored with Black women in violence and crime is the depth and the nuance. So we need to understand violence and crime where Black women are concerned in context. We need to explore these stories in depth. So how is Lindiwe Dikana transgressive in terms of crime? It's because traditionally crime and violence have been assigned as masculine things, but it's a transgression not just against the law, but against these prescriptions of femininity. Supersad is someone who really launched my paper because initially I was struggling with the vocabulary and the arguments that I wanted to make. And so this was one of the quotes that I began to build on. And he speaks to the fact that the nature of patriarchal society translates to very specific gendered expectations on women, and these are they're refined in the media, and it's what I was speaking about earlier on, that because African culture relegates values and morality to Black women, we see it on screen in the ways that women have been reduced to particular stereotypes, like the mammy figure, the strong Black woman. This is just a perpetuation of what exists in society. And then finally, these were my thoughts some of my thoughts, at least, from my dissertation. Ultimately, it can be said that the portrayals of matriarchs in the study contribute to a broader reimagining of Black female characters on screen, creating avenues where they can be depicted as flawed, vulnerable, and defiant. These representations mark a significant departure from traditional representations of the Black matriarch. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamodibe. That was amazing. I find it very interesting that you chose those two shows, The River and The Queen, because those two actresses are veteran actresses who have played acceptable Black roles in the past for many, many years, like Generations and in Movango. Can you speak a little bit about them also being executive creative producers on those specific shows, and how having women at the table in key creative decision making helps reshape like African women's stories?
It's very tempting to say that if we have Black women as executive producers, then Black female representation is safe. But I hasten to say that because we need to consider that television is a collaborative medium. There's the director, there's so many lines of decision making. And so I don't necessarily think that one creative role is going to change what we see on screen, but perhaps the presence of more Black women in these roles can then give rise to a potential of more nuanced and more well-researched and different experiences in terms of how Black women have been framed. Something that I touched on very early in my dissertation I didn't mention tonight. The representation of Black women has always been in the hands of either African male writers, white supremacists, or white feminists. And so, there is room for more Black women in this space, but I don't think it's just about if she's an executive producer, we're in good hands. I think it is a collaborative effort for us to dig deep into how we represent Black women.
I love the emphasis on Mama Winnie Mandela Mandela, because she's the prime example of your subject. And we have men with very complicated personal lives, but who still are celebrated as heroes in this country. And I think what she was fighting for when she spoke about herself is always her humanity. And can you speak a little bit about when we see these representations, how else we can treat women and see them as human?
I think I touched on it this evening about when Black men or men on screen are portrayed in their complexity, they are celebrated. But when women are automatically vilified, and it's because there is a history to it, even in African literature. Women were either mother of Africa or they were sexually deviant. And so with Mama Winnie's very complicated history, she was the Mama Africa, the mother of the nation. And we know that the case of Stompie then complicated her legacy, and automatically she became the monstrous mother to society. And these dichotomies they're rigid, they're reductive, and they don't allow for Black women to exist in their fullness, as complicated, as vulnerable, but they also then reveal to us the double standards that exist for prescriptions of femininity, because as soon as she engaged violence within the political struggle, she was a villain, but she was doing the exact same thing that men within the political struggle were doing. So all of these things reveal to society, again, those double standards, and who's setting these dichotomies, who's setting these rigid ways of existing. It's not helpful, because I think it dehumanizes Black women, and it cuts off society from being able to embrace Black women in their fullness.
Let me open it up to the floor. Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah. Go ahead, Apiwe.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, Khodi. Can you hear me? Hi, Mamodibe. Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. I think you raised quite a couple of insights that I think we should be thinking around in terms of feminist theory when it's translated on television. I want to make a comment first and then pose a question that I think I'm also still sort of thinking through as well. So it was interesting for me to see how you were able to sort of lay the groundwork around how we think about Ukuzila. And it just reminded me, I don't know if you know Kokelwa Jedimlongo, who wrote quite a brilliant, her MA is on Xhosa widows and citizenship, and she sort of explores how what does life look like after Ukuzila. And I don't think we get to see a lot of those articulations on our television and on our television stories. And I was just excited to hear some of the insights that you were just sharing just around how representation specifically when we're thinking around those stories tends to look like. And I'm hoping that we're able to see more of that because Ukuzila sort of becomes the defining almost moniker or identity of a woman, and it almost becomes difficult to shake it off and becomes almost you. So it's quite interesting to always hear people sort of complicate this idea of feminist theories and how we sort of think about Ukuzila post specifically the period. But how are you able to reclaim womanhood and think about yourself outside of that? And then my question that I'm sort of thinking through as well is I'm wondering, I mean, I think it also just speaks to a little bit to the first question that Khodi asked. I'm wondering if I think there is appetite. So I think I know that there's appetite, but I'm wondering if as audiences we are comfortable enough in engaging unruly women on our screens. Because I think when the unruly woman shows up, sometimes we have difficulties with digesting her. It only happens post. So for instance, Ntsiki Lukele, that during the era, there were a lot of like conflicting ideas around her. Mamfundisi as well, just still on the same show in Generations to the point where her character had to be killed off. So I wonder sometimes as South African audiences, how big of an appetite do we have for unruly women? Because there's always like a point of contestations around how those articulations are received by your average South African. And of course, I think in contemporary times, the appetite seems to be growing. But I still think there's some level of conservative sentiments around having women who refuse to behave on our television screens. And I usually even see this sometimes when I engage it with my own research as well, that when I do post something on platforms like Twitter, there'll be quite a handful of folks who are a bit we don't want to see this. It's radicalizing, it's this, that third or the other. So I'm wondering, in terms of audiences, never mind the people who are writing and producing, are we seeing or do you think, maybe in your perspective and some of your insights, if there's appetite for unruly women and just women who refuse to behave on our television screens?
I won't have an exhaustive response. It might require me to go and write another article because it's an audience receptive type of question. One, I just want to touch briefly on Ntsiki's character. In fact, when I went back, I realized that she wasn't remotely doing what Harriet and Lindiwe were performing on screen. She was just within the soap opera genre, modeled as the woman, the type of femininity that women should not be inspiring towards. And all Nziki was she was outspoken and she was assertive. And it's interesting, the storyline then did the typical soap opera thing where Sbusi Lomo's character, who then represents patriarchy, had to kill her very violently. And so Nziki, when I look back, did not do anything remotely like taboo compared to the woman we're discussing this evening. I think that the appetite is there. However, I think the ways in which we start to think about these women need to move away from words such as, the villain, or unruly, because what is unruly and ungovernable or misbehaving? I think the language in which we attach, and that's why I specifically went to go and explore transgression, because it allowed for a deeper, more nuanced exploration. Because as soon as we say villain, we demonize. As soon as we say unruly, we dehumanize. But these are women who are just allowing themselves to be complex and to be vulnerable, and to just engage life as any other human being would. So I think that the appetite is there. I think we need to start thinking differently about how we frame them. I mean, throughout Lindiwe Dikana's reign on the river, she was always being said to be a villain. And I was always fighting that. Is she a villain? What is she doing? Can we understand her story in context? Can we understand her engagements with crime and violence in context? Granted, there was some creative ways to make the story, gripping and interesting, and it diverted into different avenues. But at the core of it, and Wendy actually speaks about this when she refers to Rosa Parks, the American political figure, that her anger then transformed into justified, organized activism. And for many of these women, even with Harriet Koza, she kills her husband because not only is he having extramarital affairs, but he was ready to kick her out, and she did absolutely nothing wrong. And so for women in these contexts, even with Sonto, she comes from poverty or something like that, not to justify crime or make crime novel, but to say, let's tell stories about Black women who deviate in depth and give it context, so that one Black woman's story is not universal representation of other Black women. Yeah, and you see, you got me thinking.
Yanko, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think this was very helpful to understand. I think also how to view characterization of women in shows and movies. But my question is more, I think, kind of look at it from two sides. I think the one side is based off of your research, what do you want producers, writers, directors, actors, what do you want them to get about portrayal, the writing, and the representation of the female in series and movies, but also for people who just watch stuff? How do you want us to how do you think your research teaches us to engage with female characters?
Okay, I'll try and be concise. So one of the things that come up in my recommendation speaks back to the point I've made about thinking differently about women who transgress on screen. And the framing is also important, right? So what contributes to the framing is there context to these transgressions. What is novel for me is not that Lindiwe Dikana or Harriet Koza are killing or they're getting into drugs. That's not novel. The crime is not novel, but it's now we're seeing the novelty of Black women being allowed to exist in this spectrum. So from a production point of view, I think it's how do we frame? Do we give context? Do we give depth? Do we explore these storylines as they need to be? And then in terms of audiences, Pumla Qola speaks about the interesting tension between feminism having then said we have achieved equality, but we still live in rape capital in South Africa, right? That these conversations are so progressive in the public domain, but women are still living under what is called cult of femininity. So the more we see women push back on screen, we're not promoting violence or crime. I'm not celebrating it. But the more we emancipate a woman who is in a village, who's watching the story, remember TV is also an area for meaning making, who's watching a story of abuse, and she's finding ways to come out of her own abuse, because that's what TV is for South Africa. It shapes how we think as society. So we're actually we're slower in pace in terms of the USA, because How to Get Away with Murder and Olivia Pope have already done this thing about complicated Black women, but it's okay. It speaks to the context that we're in. I think the more we see Black women in their fullness, it contributes to how we engage with women in society as well.
Because of time, we have one last question in the chat. And thank you, Sia, for answering the questions in the chat for the people who didn't get to ask you in your first session. So the last question we're going to address tonight is from Sunny Lee Swe Badly. He or she or they say, so powerful, thank you, Mamodibe. So when it comes to collaboration, how much should actors and cinematographers talk to each other about how character is being visually represented, especially if that character is challenging ideas of femininity? Can an actor be performing empowerment while the cinematographer is actually making the character look vulnerable, threatening, or sexualized? And how do we recognize when this is happening? Is this a boundary? Is this boundary ever broken?
Such a late.
Yeah. So it's just about the technical framing. And I've seen it also in cinema where someone is being raped on screen, but it somehow looks sexy. Like, so I see it in that context that you can be intentionally trying to say something else, but then the framing of it can still kind of communicate a different thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think what hasn't been afforded, and I speak in my own experience, I'm not speaking for all actors, what hasn't been afforded to actors is that dialogue. Because it's so interesting how the story in its movement from production, pre-production, production, and it's interpreted in various aspects. But what has been key, and I will cite this one example. There was a character that I played, and in her description, she was said to be a tomboy. But in a romantic scene, there was a demand that she shows up half naked. And so I thought, one, I'm not comfortable with that. But two, it doesn't serve how you have set this character up. And I had to go back and forth with the director, because also some of these choices are like, do you want to perpetuate an imagery of a romantic scene that you've seen before, or are you locating the romance between these two characters specifically in this context? So I think it's a dialogue we need. I think egos aside, it's a dialogue that we need to acknowledge that actors are also very active participants in telling the story. And if it is a specific positionality that an actor occupies and they're contributing to that way of thinking, it shouldn't be seen as a stumbling block. And I know it's a very rich conversation to have, because time constraints are a thing on set, but if we're open to the ideas that you might be thinking of something in a particular way, but the way we're filming it, or the way we've dressed me from the scene, it's communicating something totally different. I don't think boundaries are crossed in that regard. I think it's collaborative. The creative process is collaborative, and we need to allow actors to have that dialogue on set with cinematographers and directors.
Thank you so much. That's our time for tonight. Thank you so much, Sia. Thank you, Mamodibe, for sharing your incredible research with us. And thank you for all the filmmakers and audiences in the room. Thank you for engaging. Thank you so much for the love of the second webinar between Frames of Freedom and Fame Week Africa. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, everyone.